My name is Patrick O'Connell, and my address is 228 South Cleveland in Moscow. And the situation that I'd like to address is I'm a landscape architect. I own a design and build firm, and I've been in business for about 36 years in town. And kind of a new situation that I see happening is a lot of these older people in these older neighborhoods, their fences need addressment. After 40 years, the posts are rotting, the 2x4 stringer rails are deteriorating, the fences are in disrepair. With the new ordinance, and this is really kind of occurring on the problem that I see is arising on any corner lot. I don't see it so much as an issue of sight lines. I see it as adopting a new code that was written somewhere else and isn't sensitive to Moscow's situation. A lot of these clients are in their late 70s, 80s, 90s. Their fences are in disrepair, and now where they've had their yards and their landscape beds for the last 40 years in the situation they are now the new code addresses that their fence has to be moved back another 20 feet back unless they rebuild it 3 feet or 4 feet with half of the spacing being open. Another situation, some of these corner lots have swimming pools, so it's kind of a catch-22. They can't repair the 6-foot fence that has to go around it, and they'll have to put a 3-foot fence, which means, you know, the swimming pool is now going to be a attractive nuisance to young children. So I was talking to Wayne Krause, and I was coming up with some ideas. I think when I was talking to Mike Ray down at the city in the building department, I think we could address each one of these situations. I'm not talking about new construction and new neighborhoods. I'm talking about existing neighborhoods where the fences have been up for 40 years. The landscape beds have been addressed. Maybe they could have a little bit of leeway to address what I call like historic privilege or heritage privilege, to where they can make a decision at that time if it's not obscuring sight line or making a traffic situation. I'm finding when I'm looking at these situations that if you owned a corner lot, you really don't own anything to almost where your house starts. That whole side property, which a lot of these houses are, that's the only yard they have. They might only have 15 feet to the back of the property line. All their property is on both sides of the house. And by going to the right-of-way and then another 20 feet, they're almost to their garage. There might be enough room for a gate, but I think if it's done tastefully, creatively, I think they could have their yard back. And I think every fence could be addressed individually. I think the people downtown are easy to work with, and I think they have the capability to address this from issue to issue. But right now, they have to follow the code, and their hands are tied.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Connell. I'd like Bill Belknap to respond to this. He's our Community Development Director.
So the zoning code, I know it was been in effect since at least 1991. The zoning code does limit the height of fences in the front yard setback. Most commonly, depending upon the zoning district, that ranges from 15 feet to 20 feet from the front property line into the property. And it does limit the height of solid fences to no more than 3 feet in height, and open fences can be 4.5 feet in height. Once you get back behind that front yard setback, then you can go to a 6-foot solid fence. And it also applies to street side yard setbacks. So if you're in that street side yard, which might be 13 to 15 feet, we reduced the R1 recently, that same limitation is in effect. So if you're out in that front, in that street side setback, solid fences can only be 3 feet high or 4.5 feet for an open fence. I believe the intent when the city adopted that standard was to try to maintain kind of the openness of front yards and street side yards as you kind of wrap around. and to avoid what can be somewhat of kind of a stockade look if you have 6-foot fences out in front of homes, out in close proximity to the sidewalk. But there are a number of homes that either fences were established prior to the standards that came into effect in 91, where they have existing fences that may be in those setback locations that may be higher than the standards that are allowable today. That's what we consider to be a non-conforming structure or non-conforming fence. It's allowed to remain. They're allowed to do repairs, but if it's a wholesale reconstruction, they are obligated underneath the code as it is written today to meet the current standards within the zoning code. So that's currently what exists. I mean, we certainly could explore, but it really would have to take a look at all of the nonconformity language of the code. When the council adopted the code in 91 and the nonconformity language that existed, the intent was that things that were not in compliance with those new standards would kind of be lost in time, and new construction and replacements would become in conformance with those standards, so that there's a uniform standard for all property owners and they all have the same rights and opportunities. And there are cases where we have had variances requested because either they've had a historical fence there, or it was that example of a home that was developed where they really had no rear yard or very limited rear yard area, and oftentimes that street side was what they were using effectively as their rear yard area. And so there have been variances granted to allow for the construction of fences that exceeded the standard, but those have to be considered by the Board of Adjustment on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks, Bill. Walter, did you have a question?
Well, I think I'm more clear about what Mr. O'Connell's talking about. You're talking about fences that need to be repaired that then fall under the ordinance because they are non-conforming?
No, yeah, they're in need of repair right at this point, and you could do it hodgepodge and put a diagonal up, and I mean, that's just not the way to do it. Usually the posts are rotting about 13 inches down, so it's time to put a new fence in. Okay. But they've established the border, and like Bill had said, some of these houses, and the one I'm talking is, I'm doing a project for Rich and Pat Coster on 925 Park Drive by Triangle Park. And beautiful, beautiful yard, and been there 40 years, and now that whole yard is going to be lost. And I understand the Fort, Apache stockade look, but I don't think that's the situation in a lot of these. A lot of these corner lots, they don't start the fence really till the front facade, and then wrap around the side property, then connect to the back property, and then all the way back to the house. It's not like somebody's putting a 6-foot fence right off the sidewalk up there. And especially in this situation, that is their yard. And another one that I was addressing, if you take Blaine Street and run it right through to D Street right there, there's a pool behind that fence. That fence needs to be repaired, and it's going to be the same situation. And there's a pool back there.
Well, one of the things that Bill had mentioned, Mr. O'Connell, was the fact that we do have a Board of Adjustments,
right,
and variances can come in front of that board.
Right.
And they can determine that, and that would be, the basis of them making a determination.
John? I think it's more than a variance. I think it's, trying to get all this stuff across the board, so one sentence, I mean, the whole code is like one paragraph. And in my 40 years of working in this town, it's every situation is not just so cut and dry.
John, you had a question?
Yeah, Bill, didn't you just say that when it comes time to repair these fences, that is, it's not cut and dry what you have to do or what has to be done? Each activity or each occurrence is judged on its own merit. So, for example, if you had one fence, I'm sorry, but you can't replace this. Another fence, you can replace most of it. Did I hear you right, or?
If I may, in most instances, in all instances, the code standards are the same. If somebody's doing a repair, so let's say they're only going to be replacing a few posts or a couple of boards, then certainly a repair is something that they can do. But if is a replacement of more than 50% of the fence or the materials, then we consider that to be the establishment of a new fence, or essentially constructing a new fence, and then it does have to meet that new standard. There have been variances that have been granted. One in the park neighborhood, I recall a few years ago, that was that similar situation, and I think we probably see this more often on street side yards than front yards. It's the one that I've seen has been the corner lots, and it's the street side yard that is really oftentimes the more significant issue. And the Planning and Zoning Commission in the last year has looked at modifying or reducing, or I guess I should say allowing an encroachment of fences up to 6 feet height into street side yards, but only to a certain distance. We have looked at an earlier draft, and that's been under conversation, and I can certainly bring this up with the Planning and Zoning Commission when they meet and see if we can further that conversation.
Okay, thank you.
One other, you said 50%, is that part of the code, or is that a city policy?
That has just been a rule of thumb that is not defined in the code what is considered to be a new fence construction. It was if more than half the fence is now new material, that's essentially what we consider to be replacement.
Wayne, you got a question?
On a corner lot, on the side facing the street, the side of the house facing the street, is there a particular distance that you can go away from the street? If the setback is 15 feet, supposing somebody went, if they had a 80-foot wide lot, say they went 40 feet back from the street, would that still apply as far as the height and the type of fence?
So the setback is measured from the beginning of their property line towards the homes, in towards the interior portion of the lot. And so it's 15 feet or it's 13 feet, depending upon the zoning district, and that is a street side setback. If the fence is going to be placed within that area, then those height limitations come into effect. If the fence was going to be established farther into the lot, so let's say it's a district that has a 15-foot street side setback, as long as they're 15 feet in from the property line, they can go to a 6-foot high solid fence at that point.
And Bill, I heard you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said Planning and Zoning is looking at this now?
We have discussed it in the last year, and we had an early draft looking at allowance of a reduction or essentially a encroachment, because there are certainly situations where that street side setback, especially on corner lots, did reduce kind of the usable rear yard area if it was a fairly shallow depth of lot.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Connor.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was aware of this situation. It keeps reoccurring, and that 50%, I mean, you could do 50% one year, 50% the next year, you have a new fence. You never had to get the permit. You know, you could just do it as a repair. So I just think it needs to be readdressed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.